Thank you. Test. Christoph, are you with us? I think we have you online, Christoph. We just need to make sure that we have your audio and your camera with us as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we cannot see you.
Okay. I thought I put the camera on. I will try again.
It is showing like a black, and now it's not showing at all.
Okay.
Which one?
Oh, sorry. This one, yes. Yeah. All the speakers this side? Up to them, really. It doesn't matter. We can mix and match.
Does it have any graphics and movements or not?
No.
Okay, great. No, because movement do not show properly in WebEx.
I stayed away from it. No, Lava.
Good to
Nice
meet
to meet you finally in person.
All right.
It's a pleasure. Okay. Yeah, I missed my connecting flight from Turkey, but I arrived today.
Okay, great. We can see you, Christoph.
Okay.
Will you be having any presentation to show?
No, I will have no presentation.
Okay, no problem. So, Christoph, would you try please to mute your microphone, and then whenever it's time for you to speak, you can just unmute yourself and speak directly into the room.
Okay, we'll do so. Thank you.
We'll kick off in just a second. I'll try to upload the presentation as well.
Is it working? Cool.
Okay, welcome everyone to this session after lunch. I hope you're all well nourished. The session will be, as you can see, on non-state actors in Europe and beyond, particularly their role in shaping norms of appropriate behavior in cyberspace. And first of all, I would like to thank our host, who is providing this platform for us, and also EuroDiG for agreeing to host this workshop. And as you know, probably from previous experience, a session doesn't come together just by itself. So it always involves a lot of people contributing. And I would also like to thank everyone who contributed to this session, which also includes you today, because we want to make it a very lively session and count on your engagement. And in particular, I would also like to thank Tatiana, who is just behind you, and Lauren, who have acted as session organizers as well and have contributed quite substantially. And of course to our panelists, which you will see towards the front, without which this session would not be possible. I'm going to introduce them shortly in a bit. And just in terms of the layout of the session and the structure, Tatiana and I are going to try to guide you through it as best as we can. We hope for a lot of participant interaction as well. We hope for a lot of remote interaction. We encourage that. And to keep participants on their feet, we devised a number of questions which we're going to pose. And we hope, technology bearing with us, that we can make that a lively interaction as well. Now, for the participants in general, you should use this session to challenge our panelists with tricky and hot questions, norms-related questions that might be on your mind and that you would like to have answers to. And this workshop in particular benefits from the presence of Wolfgang Kleinwächter, who is member of the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, Martin, who is right next to him on the ICANN board, Nata, who sits next to Martin, who is head of the Legal Department and Data Exchange Agency of Georgia. We have Dominique next to Nata, who is a public policy director at GSMA, and our remote participant, Christoph Steck, who hopefully we'll see shortly. At the moment, we do not because of the presentation, but I'm sure we can switch that around. Now, I'll ask the panelists to provide a little bit more detail about themselves in a little while. And for now, let's kick off with the first question as an introduction question. So, may I please ask the technical staff to switch to the first question on Mentimeter. I can sound it out already, just so we have an idea. The first question is, who do you think is most engaged in norm-building processes? And here we expect a word cloud. Who do you think either is most important or who do you think is most engaged? Let's see if it works. So if you have access to your phone or laptop, you can go to menti.com, enter the code, and we should see a beautiful word cloud, hopefully growing on the other link. We'll just need to switch the screens again. It's a bit of a back and forth. And please let me know if it's working. So again, the code is 745516, and the address is menti.com. There we are. Okay, it's building. So far we have states, civil societies, I'm assuming it's international organizations, the private sector. Let's see who is getting the most votes for now. Lobbyists, that's an interesting one. Law enforcement agencies. Whoever said me, I would like to talk to this person because that would help a lot, having a direct person to talk to. Okay, so in terms of numbers of votes, it seems to be that the private sector is most engaged in norm-building processes and lobbyists as well, according to the voting capacity here. Which is actually a perfect bridge in terms of what we want to cover. Okay, it keeps growing. Because what this session is about is non-state actors, and private sector is a prominent example. Figures, yeah, on our list. Technical communities now appearing as well. And just to give you a bit of background in terms of norms discussion, you might be aware that norms-based discussions started, or at least the discussion about regulating behavior in cyberspace by means of an international treaty, for example, started already to surface in the late 1990s with a proposal by the Russian government to work on a legally binding cybersecurity treaty that was proposed within the setting of the United Nations. And then from there moved across various stages, got a bit softer in terms of moving from legally binding treaties towards what we often associate with softer norms. And moved through different stages of what is called the UN Group of Governmental Expert meetings, the latest instance of which resulted in a non-consensus outcome in 2017. And while there has hardly been any agreement on how to address responsible behavior in cyberspace early on, we see a bit more convergence now, and particularly we see the surfacing of quite a number of non-state actors in this area. And that being said, I would now turn to the panelists. I hope to have provided a bridge and ask them, first of all, to introduce themselves, again, a bit in more context, and highlight their affiliation with or confrontation with norms in particular, and whether or not they matter. So we'll kick off with Wolfgang, if that's okay, as one of the members, as I said, of the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, who have just issued their second norm, and maybe Wolfgang can tell us a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, questions of cyberspace and norms is indeed a long story. And it did not start with the Russian proposal in 1999. So we had this discussion already in the 1990s. And I think the first real proposal on the table was the proposal from the Vice President of the United States of America in the ITU Telecommunication Development Conference in Buenos Aires in 1994, when he proposed a global information infrastructure. And part of this GII proposal was, you know, to frame a little bit the emerging information society. This was followed by a proposal by the EU Commissioner Martin Bangemann in 1997 to draft a declaration for the information society, and this triggered a process which led to the World Summit on the Information Society. The Russian proposal in the General Assembly of the United Nations was much more oriented on security issues, on hard security issues, while the other proposals were more of a general nature to frame the information society. And we had the World Summit on the Information Society, where the question of, do we need a cyberspace treaty, like a treaty for the law law of the sea or outer space? And the debate in all these years was, no, if you introduce too strong regulation in a field which is full of innovation, then you stifle innovation and then you stop the development. So that means the Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, argued in Geneva in 2003 that for the first time in history that we discuss an issue which we have not yet a knowledge about the dimension. So that means let's keep the space as free as open, let's stimulate innovation and then come back if we have a clearer picture. How much we have to regulate or not, and how much we have to have norms and not. And I think with all the events in the last 5-7 years, we have, I would not say a turning point, but the general approach is changing, and you have now a much greater pressure and a broader understanding that norms are not only a bad thing, norms are needed. You know, with so many, let's say, bad actors in the cyberspace, so you have to stick for certain rules. You have to agree on certain rules, and then you have also to implement certain rules. And insofar, you know, the reaction to the Russian proposal in the United Nations General Assembly changed a little bit, and they were looking for a middle way, which led to the group of governmental experts, and not to hard legal norms, but to confidence-building measures and some soft norms, and which paved the way for a new approach. And it's not only governments anymore which act in this field, it's also non-state actors, but we will come back to this a little bit later, the role of non-state actors. But I think it's important to have this historical understanding, so then you can much more clearer define what are the realistic options for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. I believe Tatjana has a question.
Wolfgang, could you please reflect on the results of this poll? Because it is interesting, we started with the norms and Russian proposal and development, and the word regulation was said several times. But now when I see on the screen, we see like the most responses was for civil society, private sector, technical communities. Do you think this is more aspirational or reality? Does it reflect reality?
You know, you are a lawyer, you know that law is made either by parliaments nationally or in intergovernmental negotiations by states. So, and the group of governmental experts in the consensus report on 2015 agreed that international law is relevant both offline and online. And insofar, you know, this reflects not the reality. The reality is that if it comes to legal norms, then it's in the hand of governments. But the challenge is now because we know that governments cannot control the whole cyberspace. They do not have the knowledge to understand if it comes to issues like attribution. So insofar, there is now, we are not yet there, but there is a debate to go beyond purely intergovernmental arrangements and to include more private sector at the moment. And I'm surprised that civil society is here the strongest partner, because this is indeed a good proposal. It's a good idea, but at the moment it's wishful thinking. Civil society is not sitting on the negotiation table. It should be, because they are affected by the results, but the reality is it's government only, and they open the door a little bit to the private sector.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. So maybe for every panelist further, if you want to reflect on aspiration versus reality and on the issue, shall we change the norms? Maybe not in your introductory statement, but maybe better. And for everyone in the room, because I believe that you have your opinion, especially those who put civil society there. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll move on to Martin, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm Martin Botterman. I'm on the ICANN board. And I would also like to speak in my private capacity as an independent strategy advisor on internet and society. I would say, from an ICANN perspective, that part of the norms, not being the legal norms, are set in our contracts with our contracted parties. They determine elements that contribute to a secure and stable internet in terms of the DNS system. It's a minor part of it, but it's a part and it's a norm. It's not a legal norm, but it's a contractual norm. I think if we wider look to the industry, that we see that there's an interest of industry to also keep up certain norms to allow a market to flourish, to allow consumers to want the products, and to make sure that not too much abuse of those consumers has been made. In that way, there's also soft norms that are developed by industry that sometimes they keep each other to in terms of self-regulation. So I think that's been growing importance as well, because the legal norms, next to the international law, are only applicable in the country itself, and that makes it very limited, particularly when you talk about cyberspace. Civil society in that, I would say, is an aspirational remark here. Civil society is important in noticing mishaps and raising the flag and starting discussions, but it's very seldom, in my experience, that they end up setting the norms. They may stimulate industry to come to norms, they may stimulate states to come to agreements, but they don't set the norms themselves, is my experience. And if people disagree, please let that be known. So altogether, because of the limitation of law, that first cannot follow the quick developments of technology adoption in society, but secondly is limited mostly by national borders. I think it's very important to see that state actors have to step up even more and can also not hide behind laws that exist to set norms. Therefore, very clearly are responsible for making sure that the norms are there, are kept to, and are known to those people using the products and services that are related to it.
If I may, do we have any interjections or questions to Martin's comment? I see a raised hand at the end. No? Okay, that was a false alarm. I would challenge...
So everybody agrees. Thank you.
I would challenge or ask one question. Please, the gentleman at the end of the row. Please go ahead.
Jörg Schweiger, just more of a comment than a question. I think we got those answers because we were using the term norm, and maybe we should just define what we do mean by norm, because sometimes panelists have been using law as a specific norm, or defined that law could be a norm as well, where some of us may have more or less the interpretation that a law would not be called a norm.
Thank you very much for your comment. Actually, this is why after Wolfgang's intervention, I asked the question, do you think that we have to change the general notion of norms? Because actually, I mean, if you think in general, right, what is norms? Norms are the standards of behavior that everyone should follow. It could be law or whatever. So, and then what do you mean when we say norms? When we say engagement into norms making? So further to your comment, I agree with you that maybe we don't mean the same thing. Whoever put civil society means something different, and this is something to hear from you.
But just one remark, I don't think there's norms that everybody supports. But it's generally accepted norms.
Yeah.
This, you just basically asked the question I was going to discuss at the beginning of my presentation. And if it's okay, I might just talk briefly about norm setting and not focus specifically on the GSMA at the moment. But basically, I mean, I was thinking about this because I was at SciCon with Wolfgang last week. And that's the NATO Cyber Conflict Conference. And there was a lot of discussion, unfortunately after you left, Wolfgang, around the norms that that particular group, NATO, and its and some of its allies, as well as the private sector and other actors, but primarily government, are what there was a lot of discussion around the fact that that's Western norms, right? So that would include in terms of cyber conflict, non-aggression, initial aggression unless being attacked, things like that. So my question, I think, to all of us, or something that we should think about is, if norms are adopted by certain countries and by signaling from those countries, including like attribution and various things that they're adhering to those norms, not everyone else is going to adopt those norms, right? So if you think about cyber conflict, you think about the fact that maybe one country, state-on-state attack, those two different states are likely to be operating under their separate definitions of norms, right? And so I think it's a question for all of us to think about what does that actually mean in terms of like if there are norms that have been set, but not everyone's adhering to them at the same time. And it was an interesting discussion because the author of the Talon manual was there as well, who happens to be very charismatic and very interesting. But from the private sector perspective, maybe just, and I think Christoph will probably speak a little more about this, hopefully with the Tech Accord and some other principles and things. The mobile industry itself has developed a set of key principles to adhere to in terms of privacy, security, and data protection. And I can go into that later, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this, Dominique. I think we already see an interesting development in terms of, first of all, the question being asked, what are norms, and having different perspectives at the table. And I would now like to move to Christoph, if possible, to comment on it from a private sector perspective, if that's possible. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well, yeah.
Fantastic. Good. So first of all, sorry that I cannot be with you, but I have to say it's fantastic to be sitting here in my office and be able to contribute and to listen to your comments. So a little example how well the internet is working, I have to say. So fantastic to see that working so well, and congratulations to the organizers. That's really well done. Just to continue what Dominique just commented, I mean, what is a norm? From our point of view, I would say there are maybe 3 or 4 different types of norms. I mean, first of all, there is something what we will call regulation or a law, and that's obviously what we all know. Then there is something which you might call self-regulation. It means that, you know, the private sector in itself, together with others maybe, but mainly not driven by governance or governments or anyone, is setting norms of behavior. And then there is something which might be in the middle, which you might call co-regulation, which is a form of self-regulation where at the same time governments and third parties act as supervisors, for example, and so on. So it's a kind of in-between what we might call regulation or self-regulation. And the fourth dimension are standards from my point of view. So standards, we forget very often that there are many standards set, and actually standards very much help us to coordinate globally or at least regionally a lot of these activities. And I suppose that that's an interesting area to think more about. What do we need to do on the side of standards for cybersecurity? And the reason for that is that going forward, the big change we're going to see for the internet is that we're going to connect a lot of things to it. So we're going to see the Internet of Things happening, and we all know that. But what it really means is that anything, any device can become intelligent and will be, of course, also a source of cybersecurity risk. So up to now, I think we are actually living in a quite easy to manage world, because the people and the companies who are responsible for the major infrastructure and service platforms and so on are actually technology companies, and they know more or less what they're dealing with. But tomorrow, you know, any any washing machine can become an intelligent, connected device with all the risk for cybersecurity. And I suppose that most of the people who are going to construct these things will not be experts on that. So, and might not have the resources even, if you think about more simpler things being connected to care about cybersecurity. So I think we're going into a time where risks are going to increase exponentially and very fast, and we have to think how to manage that. And I suppose that, for example, standards and norms could be a good way which could help on that.
Thank you very much for this perspective, Christoph. I'll move now to Nata, and this is a rather traditional perspective in the sense that it comes from a public perspective. So Nata, if you were... perfect, Christoph just needed to mute himself, I think. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I represent Data Exchange Agency, which is working in terms of e-government and cybersecurity in Georgia. And here is our perspective that we see in Georgia, that international legal regimes and cyber norm-making process, as I understand, is government-to-government deliberation process. And clearly, international subjects of international law are states who are negotiating through legal or diplomatic channels what is the regime. Quite honestly, I'm very skeptical about Microsoft's Digital Geneva Convention and how really even big multinational companies can dictate international conventions. rather though, of course, industry, of course, private companies have a big role in shaping sector-specific standards, in applying these standards and building capacity and building new technology based on these legal adjudications. But at the same time, these are states who should agree. And we can say that there are a lot of failures, as we've seen from the UN GGE of 2017, but still there are a lot of progress made by states. At least we have came to the standpoint that when we say that cybersecurity is not law-free zone, and law applies, and we need the interpretation of this law. And again, there are a lot of discussion between lawyers whether we need separate branch of law, or just we have to interpret the existing legal regimes to cybersecurity and not have parallel conventions to physical and offline and online world. This is, again, the next topic of discussion. And as a continuation of this question, I see that, yes, private sector plays a big role, but it's still government's responsibility to come to international binding legal regimes.
Thank you very much for this, Nata. Do we have any questions? Now we've heard quite controversial positions. Looking around the room.
Questions or statements? Because while you are thinking, I would sum up what really struck me here. First of all, civil society on the word cloud, how aspirational this is. And I believe that those of you who put civil society there might want to provide your point of view. Then, of course, what norm mean? And I believe that this is the biggest source of divergence here. Because if we mean norms as binding agreements between the governments, of course, they're not flexible in terms of stakeholder shaping them. But if we mean industry standards, this might be quite broad and flexible. And then, of course, what struck me about NATO's contribution is, I will not provide my personal opinion here, although I support it, that big digital companies cannot dictate conventions as binding norms. Let's put it like this, as far as I understand. So, yes, please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. So my name is Lyra. I'm really happy to be on this panel, and I have one comment. If we think about the sovereignty of cyberspace and independency of cyberspace, why we need the governments to regulate anything? They didn't shape internet or cyberspace or cybersecurity. They're only one part of the action. So I think that in this kind of norms, I have one work, it's called Geopolitics of Cyberspace, and we don't really need the governments, we only need hackers or technological communities to regulate some things about cybersecurity, because governments sometimes can provide cyber offensive over the common users or non-governmental organization, which is, like in restricted countries, very common problem. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vlada. Did I see your hand up, Vlada?
Diplo Foundation. So building up on the previous comment, I think on one hand, of course, there will be the perfect solution. Unfortunately, the problem is that the governments actually are already well into cyber armament, and that is already a politicization of cyberspace for quite some time. And we've recorded about 30 countries which openly state in their national documents, doctrines, and so on that they have offensive cyber capabilities. Which means, and this is probably not going to go down. We are not likely going to see cyber disarmament anytime soon. So in that sense, unfortunately, we need to bring in politics. There is no other way to fight politics except with politics. The other question is, however, where I think it's important that civil society and business actually impact the whole discussion, is that we are moving, because of this cyber armament, we are moving into securitization of digital space and digital questions. And you can see that through the discussions on UNGG, OSCE, and so on, where it's entirely within the security communities. And when you try to open it up a little bit beyond security communities, you have the old common feeling of the governments that they have to be closed when they're discussing security issues. They don't want to be much open. On the other hand, if we talk about the international peace and security, and the norms respectively, we are not just talking about cyber attacks. There is a broader aspect of stability, which is stability of community or digital society, digital economy, and not just the attacks as a narrow focus. And in that sense, there is a huge, huge role that other stakeholders need to play in order to sustain international peace and security. In that sense, shaping the norms doesn't only reflect the governments, which may prevent attacking critical infrastructure and so on, but it also introduces the roles of other stakeholders, such as the private sector when it comes to vulnerabilities and security by design, such as civil society when it comes to, let's say, human rights and so on. So it's much broader than just attacks and cyber conflict. It's about preserving digital economy and digital society. Thanks.
Thank you, Vlada. I think we are being flash mobbed here.
Indeed, it seems to be the case, which is why I would propose to move to the second question.
Jackie, just one moment. I think we are going to collect the third intervention. There was a hand, and then we move. Please.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name's Aidan Bertolini, and I'll keep this intervention very short because it was really just a question, and I've been intrigued by the graphic that was on the screen ahead of us and the inclusion of civil society. And I was really hoping to hear from someone who might have assessed civil society as being very engaged in norm-building processes. And maybe this is just my opinion here, but while there might be opportunity for civil society participation in the development of norms, I do feel like the reality is when there is not any particular muscle behind a position that is being put forward or a norm that is being developed, it goes nowhere. And states have muscle by virtue of their sovereignty. The private sector has muscle by virtue of economic power. And civil society, in my view, has much less influence and much less muscle, if you will, to be able to draw upon. And so if civil society was to be engaged in the norm-building process, it would really need to partner with one of those other more powerful actors. Or at least, that is my interpretation, but perhaps I'm completely mistaken and naive, and if anyone who does think that civil society holds more power than I thought it did, particularly before when it was one of the largest words on the screen, I'd like to hear from you. Thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest achievements of the discussion of the last 20 years in this field is the acceptance that issues can be settled only in a multi-stakeholder environment. So there is no way that one stakeholder alone, neither government nor the private sector, can settle internet-related issues alone. The question is how the multi-stakeholder cooperation is organized. If it comes to norm building, I think we had clear that there are different understanding of norms, political norms, technical norms, ethical norms, legal norms, and things like that. But if it comes to the role of civil society, the Net Mundial Declaration, which was adopted by the overwhelming majority of internet-related stakeholders in the world, you know, from big corporations to nearly more than 100 governments to all the ISTAR organizations and big civil society organizations. There was a process where civil society played a key role in drafting the norms which are laid down in the Net Mundial Declaration, 8 principles, which create a political framework for the information society. We should not forget, these are now existing norms. There is no need to reinvent norms for the cyberspace. What we are discussing here are also details if it comes to security. And even, you know, if governments believe they can negotiate behind closed doors, the internet-related trade pacts are a good example that this will fail. The power of the civil society was in the streets. ACTA failed. TTIP failed, not only because finally governments could not agree, because the protest in the streets was so high that finally, you know, this collapsed. And one in the field of security, I think we see an interesting development, and insofar I would partly disagree what you have said. It's not that the private sector, I would agree that the private sector cannot dictate governments what they have to do. But I think it would be wise for governments to open ears and eyes to arguments coming from the private sector and arguments coming from the civil society. If they consider norms or at least legally binding treaties for the cybersecurity field. So insofar, the multi-stakeholder spirit of cooperation is different from the old dictate that the government dictates the people what they have to do, or the private sector dictates the government what they have to do. These are outdated models. The model for the future is the multi-stakeholder equal cooperation.
Thank you very much for this intervention. Nata, do you want to respond?
Maybe
because I saw your hand flashing.
Maybe last point, I absolutely agree that cyber regime effectively works if just all the parties agree to that. Because just one stakeholder, as you say, cannot do anything. And I remember Georgian proverb that so much you share, the much you get back. So this is important, sharing opinions and getting into account the others' views.
Thank you. Martin, and then Vlada.
Just a very short addition. The definition of norms is indeed what leads to some talking that doesn't seem to come together, but maybe it does. Norms are very much at a different level. When Wolfgang talks about global level enforceable norms, it needs to be multilaterally underpinned, even when the reasoning for that is brought forward in a multi-stakeholder vision. If I talk about, for instance, the mutually agreed norms for routing security, then the rest of global society has less to do with that. Yet it is very much an element that enhances cybersecurity, because if that particular community, the routing community, keeps to those norms, we will see that there's less leaking, that there's less space for abuse. So let's distinguish that as well. There can be very specific norms for very specific communities that are very important impact on the reliability of the internet and the trust in that as a whole.
Thank you. We have two interventions from there. Vlada, you go first.
A quick one based on what Wolfgang also said. It is important to have the multi-stakeholder approach. The question is, how do we ensure with the governments that they do that? I think the main question is framing. As long as the framing of the discussion is in context in international peace and security, in security approaching to the topic, we're not going to manage it. Once we try to pull it out and show that it's about digital economy, digital society, and security in that sense, then we might be able to make them listen, possibly.
I actually quite like how multi-stakeholder meetings are put there in one word, multi-stakeholder meetings. Please, you're the next in the queue.
I just have two or three brief statements. So you mentioned innovations in the first row. I still think we don't need norms. We still need innovations in cyberspace and cybersecurity. So we need more freedom than norms and laws. And the second one, we also do talk about cyber warfare as a one buzzword. We need cyber pacifism. We don't need cyber warfare. And truly, cybersecurity is one form of cyber pacifism. But that's a long story. And the third, how can we ensure that government will act as a fair subject? Because they are using popular, they are using popular geopolitics in some topics. They are making security theaters. They're securitizing encryption, internet, deep web, dark web, privacy, and anonymity. How can we make sure that government will not use their power to convince people that something is a problem and it's not, like security theater about hackers or ethical hackers and many more? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that actually is the perfect bridge to the second questions, audience question, sorry, if we can move to that one and have another poll, because it asks, are norms appropriate tools to provide stability and security in cyberspace in Europe and beyond? And are they the right means? I think this is what you were getting at. And how can we ensure that if we take the government's position and have laws, that these are enforced fairly and not discriminatory in any kind of way? Or if we see private actors engaging in norm setting, how can we make sure these adhere to certain expectations. And in terms, I just wanted to make a comment as well in terms of talking about norms from different perspectives. I guess what we can identify, be it technical, political norms or even ethical norms, there is an underlying normative element that kind of motivates or stimulates either conception of a norm, which I think is a factor that we can rely upon. So let's move to the second question, please, on Mentimer.
I guess technology is failing us now.
We just need to click the arrow on the screen that's already up. Yeah, there we are. So, are norms appropriate tools to regulate international relations and provide stability and security in cyberspace, it should say, in Europe and beyond? And this is a less controversial poll in the sense that you only have 3 options to choose from.
No flash mobs, I believe.
Well, we can discuss afterwards, I think, once we see. Are you still able to vote or not? Right, then we'll do it without technology and just do a show of hands. So,
I totally love this idea. So I'm going to count this
Please.
part of the room and you that part of the room.
all right. Well, I'm going to ask the question, who believes that norms are the right tools to provide security and stability in cyberspace? Show of hands, please. Right, could we roughly say half of the room seems to agree? Roughly.
Mm-hmm.
Who is of a dissenting opinion? They are not the right tools.
I see one hand here, there, here, 3. Anyone else? 4.
Right, and who is undecided for whatever reason?
Well, probably those who...
All right. So let's have some context to that and explanation. Those who voted for yes, they are the right tools. Can I have a proponent arguing the case for why norms are the right tools to employ, please?
If there is no one of you who voted, because I remembered some of you, I will make volunteering from the panel because I saw a couple of hands there. Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. I think a no-brainer is that the internet is global and seamless. And what we would need is laws or treaties that would be applicable for, yes, this global medium. But most of the times we see that we are just not able to come up with treaties or laws that are internationally binding. So I do see norms as rough consensus of the IETF applied to policy. So I'm thinking of norms as something that is formulated, that is stipulated under participation of a variety of different stakeholders, and that becomes, or those norms become accepted, and by that more or less mandatory, because the different stakeholders underpin those norms, and by this underpinning we get a regulation or a mindset that is applicable for this seamless medium and not period applicable for this seamless medium. So we're not relying on governments because we cannot come up with international laws and treaties anyway. So norms will just be a substitute for something we cannot come up with, and this substitution could be stipulated by a variety of different stakeholders.
So if I may summarize and understood you correctly, it's an almost second best option because we cannot agreement on legally binding tools or laws. And I heard as well, I think, that it reflects the community aspect a bit more in terms of engaging different stakeholders to come up with solutions, if I interpret that correctly. All right, thanks. So now we have a show of hands here. Please go ahead.
Actually, I am surprised that we do not mention Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. This is absolutely a successful example of legally binding norms. Unfortunately, I do not know about multi-stakeholder participation in writing of this convention. But in Ukraine, for example, we really have multi-stakeholder platform for fully implementation of this convention, and I know that a lot of non-European countries also signed this convention. Thank you.
Thanks. Perfect intervention. Tatiana
will
wants
not
to
come as a
respond to
surprise. We do have a person from the Council of Europe who is dealing with cybercrime convention. But am I right that your hand was for norms not being the right instrument? I think that this is a very nice transition to your contribution. I'm going to ask you why.
Thank you very much. Georgi Johadze from the Council of Europe Cybercrime Program Office, but I'll be speaking on my personal behalf, not on behalf of the office. But I think I have to put my answer in the context of the question which said about security, not cybercrime. Should have been about cybercrime, my answer would have been totally different, because of course there is a norm making in cybercrime, which is criminal justice response to security challenges of cyberspace. But in security, I think there are two reasons why I think that the norms at the moment do not work. And one is that there are players who are willing to trample the norms. So basically, and they can only respond to economic or military pressure to a certain behavior. So even though there is international law to support the proper, let's say, action of states in cyberspace as well, then there are some who do not. And secondly, it also follows my previous answer, which is I'm of the opinion that the current framework of state responsibility towards each other also applies to cyberspace as well. And there is no need to reinvent the wheel, because there are lots of regulations that actually extend to states acting offline, or I would say, but also would extend to anything that they do to each other in the online world as well. So it's quite simple. But again, very big distinction between cybersecurity and cybercrime.
Thank you very much. Do we have any further? I believe that our speakers might feel abandoned. Do you have any comments to what has just been said? Or then, Jackie, over to you, unless there is someone else who wants to contribute.
Would either one of you like to add to that? No. We also had, I think, which would make for an interesting position, a show of maybes. So I know these three gentlemen, for example, raised their hand. Lauren, Aiden, Vlada, if either of you would like to comment on why you're saying maybe they're the right tool?
Well, there are two parts of the comment. One is, when it comes to regulate international relations, I don't think it's necessarily enough. And I don't think the international law is necessarily enough, because we see in aspects other than cyber that it just doesn't work. So the application of international law is something different from international law and the norms. And that's why it's not enough. We have to see how to implement and apply. When it comes to the second part of the question, provide stability and security, I'm back to my previous comment that I don't think the norms and the regulations in general are the only way to provide stability and security. It is also in the behavior and, well, standards, behavior, awareness, and all of that the other stakeholders need to do. So in that sense, it's partial. Yes, they can contribute, but there is much more that needs to be done.
Right, thank you. I'd like to turn to our private sector participants, if possible. Christoph, are you still with us? I don't see you on the screen anymore, but I hope you are. And Dominique, I can definitely see you. So maybe I'll kick off with you. And can we please ensure that Christoph is still with us and can hear us? In terms of private sector work, norms, or let's call it standards, do matter, I believe, for what you're trying to do and how you're trying to integrate the community as well. Can you provide us with a perspective on that, how you would deem the importance of these instruments?
Sure. I think I can talk about norms in terms of why I'm generalizing because our members have to agree to top-level positions in the mobile industry. But in terms of that, it's to something Wolfgang made a point about in terms of multi-stakeholderism. For the private sector, even though increasingly we tend to be running the network and owning a lot of the data centers and all the networks on which state attacks take place, in general, I'm generalizing again, one of the things that norms does for the private sector is it brings in the aspect of multi-stakeholderism. So if there is a treaty or multilateral negotiation or another GGE or another high-level panel or whatever it might be that's only multilateral or only government-focused, just like civil society, the private sector does not have access to that. Now, there are ways to participate in conferences that are UN conferences. There are governments that obviously allow for participation of civil society and private sector and others. But that's different than actual like GGE or negotiations. And so I think from a personal perspective, one of my issues with the Digital Geneva Convention is that if it's a proper convention in a UN setting, it takes away the options for other stakeholders to be there. That said, I think that convention has actually changed quite a lot and how Microsoft is approaching it. The other idea is standards. Again, one of the main issues about standards is that standards making, specifically technical standards making, has moved in the last 15 years from a multilateral focused center to a more industry-led and I would say nominally multi-stakeholder fora. So, and I'm specifically the significant drop in private sector participation in the technical standards making of the ITU and the significant increase in 3GPP and ETSI, IETF, and other standards making bodies. And that's a trend we're seeing based on obviously primarily who's building out, who's investing in the network. So I think from a technical standards point of view, it's really important to see that there are different participant levels and there tends to be a different approach in terms of there was maybe 15 years ago. And I think Wolfgang made the point that the idea of multi-stakeholderism is one of those reasons. So I think I'll stop there, but maybe Christoph, if he's online, has more, because Telefonica has done quite a lot of work on this and can answer a number of these questions specifically from their point of view.
Perfect, thank you, Dominique. Christoph, can we turn to you? Do you still hear us?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect.
I'm here. I hear you.
If you'd like to comment.
Yes, of course. And interesting debate, honestly. I think that going back to the question of the roles of different actors, of course we have to go a little bit more in detail here and say where can each basically stakeholder group contribute better or not as good in this process. And I think it's clear that no one is putting in doubt that states and governments should still work on policies and they should still work on finding international policies between them. And that will be very helpful. So the Geneva Convention, the Cybercrime Convention, the Council of Europe is a very important document and it should keep the status. But having said that, it's from 2001. 70 years old. That was before most of the companies and services we are using every day were even founded. So it might need an update, and I'm sure that the Council of Europe would like to do that. But the processes are slow, and let's not forget that. We are talking about digitalization here. It's happening very fast. At the same time, international policy processes tend to be very, very slow. So we clearly have a disconnect between the speed of developments and the speed of reaction from the government side. And that's not to criticize governments, just, if you have to agree between everyone on documents and norms, that's quite difficult. So I think solutions for that could be, first of all, that you go forward on, not on global levels, but maybe on regional levels and try to find consensus. A little bit what the European Union is doing, for example. It's still difficult, but you might have easier to. It might be easier to come to compromises when you go to regional levels, and that would also help on a global scale as well. And second of all, I would like to really make a pledge here for private companies as a key player, and of course civil society as well, but private companies, let's not forget, are the ones who run most of the infrastructures, most of the services we talk about when we speak about digital services today. And I suppose that there is a huge role we are playing already as companies in that, by following norms, by implementing the standards which are agreed between companies or given us by policymakers. And I think that's fine. But at the same time, we can also go to self-regulation. And I think Dominique mentioned earlier the Tech Accord. And just look at that. I mean, that's an agreement between, or a pledge by around 40 leading technology companies in the world. And they say that we're going to cooperate with governments. We're going to help our customers to make their digital lives safer. And we are also not going to contribute to make the internet a place for warfare. And just stay with that for a second, because, I mean, that's like Airbus saying we're not going to build any fighter jets anymore. Okay? So that's private companies pledging to not make the internet a place for warfare. And that's a huge impact. It's not setting a norm, maybe. It's just, a self-regulation, and it's something which will make our lives hopefully safer in the future. But it's very important that you have these inputs from self-regulation because they're very fast. I mean, it took us a couple of months to put that together. Telefonica is part of it. I mean, imagine coming up with something like that on a global scale. It would take years, if not decades. So we have to work here in different areas in parallel to try to make fast achievements, maybe through self-regulation, through norm setting standards. But at the same time, also, of course, the states need to work on that and need to make their homework and come up with international policy making, hopefully with input from the private sector, from civil society, because actually the internet is not like any other policy sphere.
Thank you, Christoph. If I may ask, because you mentioned the Tech Accord and the fact that Telefonica is part of it and that it's been a speedy undertaking, what were the key drivers for Telefonica's participation, for example?
We have a huge interest that the internet is a safe place. So, I mean, of course, we are here because we like people to use the internet. We like people to basically engage. And we know that there are a lot of people getting more and more concerned with the issue of cybersecurity. We speak a lot about privacy, but actually what affects your life sometimes even stronger is cybersecurity. I mean, just ask someone whose digital identity has been stolen and has been misused by criminals about cybersecurity. I mean, that's something no one of us would like to experience. It's an experience which is not very nice. So we noticed that our customers are getting more concerned with these issues. They are not going to use services if they feel unsecure. They're not going to go to online banking, to use a stupid example, if they fear that this is somehow not safe and somehow something might happen. And I can just remember that last year we had the WannaCry incident. And Telefonica was affected by it as well. And we are actually the first major player, the first company for sure, which kind of communicated openly to the whole community, publicly, to the government, to the what we have in the European system, where we have national reaction centers for these kind of cyber incidents. And we immediately communicated that there is something going on which looks like a huge attack. And the information was shared immediately with all the other networks, so people could basically take activity to kind of go against it. And then at the same time, we worked hand in hand with governments, with others, with hackers, by the way, to find solutions to the problem. And we put out, for example, a program how people could recover some of the data which was encrypted, and these kind of things. We help smaller businesses to cope with the attack. So these are very, very valuable contributions, and they're done by the private sector today already, but we might go even further here.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Dominique.
So I have to leave. I'm sorry, I have to catch a flight. I just wanted to follow up on what Christoph was saying. I think he just made a really important point. The private sector is integral, actually, to cybersecurity in every country and across Europe, obviously, and across the world in terms of exactly what he mentioned, information sharing, because oftentimes a lot of, the traffic and a lot of the changes that happen on the network that indicate either a major cyber attack or something else going on is seen first by at least operators in the first instance. And so that's another reason why there needs to be multi-stakeholder participation. But I'll just leave with one last thought. I think in terms of norms, one of the other things that we need to think about is not just talking about norms, but actually doing norms, right? So if we're going to actually, all stakeholders participate in security, safety, and I think trust is what Christoph was indicating there as well. I think we need to actually show that we're actually doing that from all our respective stakeholders groups. So thank you, and I'm sorry I have to leave, but I get to go home after 2 weeks. So
thank you very much for your last words today. Wolfgang has an intervention as well.
Yes, I think Christoph made an interesting statement which is really crucial. It is a process, and nothing is fixed, let's say, in time for a long time. And the whole development is driven by new technological environment, by, market needs and others. So, and this leads to a situation where you have always to find and to refix the balance between stability and flexibility. And I think people and users, but also governments, need both. So that means we have to have a certain degree of stability, and norms and regulation contribute to a stable environment, but you have also a flexibility. You need a flexibility, and then you have to decide, which norms, block or strangulate innovation. And insofar, this is, I would not say, it's an effort to find the right balance. But this is, it's not new. For centuries, we know that freedom goes not without responsibility. Rights are linked to duties. So that means to find the right balance is an ongoing process. And insofar, if we have legal instruments, the question is not only, as some people have said, the interpretation or then the implementation of this. So we have to enhance our understanding of the existing norms, and if there is a need, if we see things has changed, then we have to adjust it. This is a very normal process, and nothing will be fixed in stone. So if you go back in the 1990s, where all the cyber idealists and cyber pacifists were there, and so we create a new society, governments go home, now the world is in the hand of the internet community. Jeff Moss, the founder of Black Hat, made this point recently in Las Vegas, when he said, okay, we believed there is no need for governments. Then we created new networks. With the new networks came big money. With big money came the criminals, and with the criminals came the governments. Here we are again. So that means you have a circle which you can manage only if you are always up to date and include the wisdom of all involved stakeholders. And so far, again, this is the biggest achievement of the 20 years of discussion, that we have to recognize there is no one single stakeholder solution. Everybody has to sit on the table.
Thank you. Martin, would you like to react to that?
I would call for that to be a norm. That it's set in multi-stakeholder fashion, because no single stakeholder cannot do it anymore. And please remember, governments are also a stakeholder in this. And secondly, that such a norm is actually not an objective in itself. It's the sustainable future. And in that, all stakeholders also have their own responsibility. So norms without responsibility doesn't work either. So, and again, just pointing out that it's established at multiple levels, sometimes in bilateral contracts, sometimes in multilateral agreements, and sometimes by calls for action, as GCSC has done as well, like don't touch the core of the internet, respect the core of the internet. So the norm is there, and now it's up to us to live up to it.
Martin, a question. What kind of norm this would be? A standard, a law, Coming back to our issue of the norms, how would you define it?
I would say part of my norm system consists of what my parents taught me. And in that word, I would say it's of getting more conscious about responsibilities and living up to that. Because sustainable future is in the interest of all of us in the long term. The short term, there may be some gain in breaking the norm and being a beneficiary of that. And for that, we need actors to react on that. And the difficulty in the digital age is that bad behavior can partly be, well, obviously, explicitly mischievous behavior, but it can also be not doing anything, like protecting your own machines from being part of an attack to other machines, the DDoS attack, where my machine is not hurt by the fact that it's used for other purposes. So that makes it extra difficult. But it's really coming down to responsibility and pointing out what the effect is. We do know from today's public debate that not everybody agrees with that, even on whether we have global heating or not. But in the end, I think that setting those norms and calling clearly for it in the communities that are most affected for it is the way forward. And I don't want to give up on that despite these kind of exceptions.
Christoph, did you want to say something? I saw a show of hands, but maybe it was accidental. Okay, probably not, sorry. We'll move in that case. I see Vlada has a comment.
Yeah, I was wondering, building up on what Martin said, is how do we actually move this discussion that where we to some extent agree that there needs to be a multi-stakeholder approach of some sort, how do we move it more towards what the governments are currently doing within the GG and the OSCE and so on? And I think that should be one of the questions we should discuss, because here we also don't have governments actually. We do have a couple of examples. The GEC as the Global Commission is definitely a good example of how non-government stakeholders, including some governments, are helping bringing that to the agenda. The GFC, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which doesn't deal with that, actually helps bringing more communication between different stakeholders and has a potential to bring some such topics more on the agenda of the governments. There is an initiative by Swiss government. There are other governments also doing that. The Swiss government is just initiating the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior of Actors in Cyberspace, which is going to discuss the roles of states, but also the roles or responsibilities of the private sector and other communities through the interaction of different communities and what one think about the role of the another. And there'll be a couple of events throughout the year. I think in November there'll be a main conference in Geneva and so on. I'll let you know more. But there are such initiatives where we actually have to find a way to send this message that we have from this panel to the governments. And that's my question, how do we do that?
Thank you, Vlada. We have one more intervention from here.
Thank you for giving me. Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Alexei Tkachenko from Government of Ukraine, a member of the Bureau of the Convention. And I would like to give an example of what governments are doing, not only governments. So we are adjusting now our convention to the modern situation. And we set up a protocol drafting working group, which is setting up the norms which are relevant to nowadays situation. We direct cooperation with service providers, counteraction to attacks on critical infrastructure and other things. And many experts are working in this regard on these norms, and we involve private and IT sector as well to this. And this, I'm sure that this would be a positive example to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more comments from the floor? Nata, please.
I would like to give the experience from locally how in for instance, non-European country like Georgia, cyber norms are built up. With the huge demand of the international organizations like Council of Europe and the European Union, when building new cyber policy or cyber norm or information security legal acts in Georgia, we, by law, are obliged to consult and take comments from the private sector. And in private sector, we mean telecommunication agencies, internet service providers, banking sector, and watchdogs like NGO community. But what is really missing here, and we had to practice that with the second hearing in Parliament with a very critical comment of the private sector, the law was drawn back, and it was about cybersecurity, for instance. So this is the practice. But what we are missing is that this cooperation and collaboration is still sporadic. And it's still ad hoc and not institutionalized and not like a common practice rather than just good examples. And so this is, as I see from the government perspective, the direction where Georgia and maybe some other countries as well need to develop, that it's not like a good practice, but it's a really rule to have private sector involvement and active involvement in the cyber norm building process as such.
Thank you very much. I think that also goes to what Wolfgang said, that the fact it's a process, and also with processes come time requirements, so it can't just develop from now to then. We have about 15 minutes left, and I would like to maybe close with a last question and then give the floor to Ilona, who has kindly enough agreed to report for us. But before that, let me highlight a number of contentions that I heard from the room. I can already tell you that the last question is going to be, where do you see the key challenges for norm development? And greatly enough, Nata already alluded to that. And the points of contention that I've heard or taken from this discussion that we have is, first of all, of a definitional matter as well. What is a norm and what do different stakeholders consider to be a norm? Second of all, who should be responsible to develop whatever we consider to be a norm? And third of all, how can we get to alignment or congruence given that disparity of this environment? So I would kindly ask you if you have any interventions or comments on that to please comment before we hand over. Nigel, is that? Yeah, perfect, thanks.
Yes, thanks very much, and this is an excellent session. Sorry I had to miss part of it. I suppose the observation is one of the urgency, really, as no doubt others have said, and Wolfgang is probably the preeminent expert here. This discussion has been going on. It was highlighted for me in the UK in 2010 when our Foreign Secretary came back from the Munich Security Conference and said to us officials in the UK government, look, I want to do something about the internet. Well, we've heard people say we want to do something about the internet before. But he had a particular vision, and this vision was that everyone has a responsibility for the internet. It wasn't particularly norms at that stage. It wasn't captured in any particular sort of word, but it was the roles and responsibilities of different actors. That conversation led to us organising the first global conference on cyberspace in London in 2011, and that had the ambitious aim at the start of, if you like, agreeing roles and responsibilities, agreeing norms, agreeing sets of standards of behaviour, etc. on the internet. Now, that process is ongoing. There was an excellent iteration of that in India last year. That process is ongoing. Other processes are ongoing. We have the Geneva work. We have the work that the OSCE has done. We have the work that the government group of experts have done. We now hear that the UN Secretary General is contemplating setting up a UN panel to look at some of these issues as well. So there's an awful lot of work in this area. It's clear that governments can't take it forward on their own, as we found from the government group of experts' work. It's clear that it has to involve all stakeholders, but how is it going to involve all stakeholders? Who is going to take responsibility for this? Who is going to take the leadership for this? Who is going to get people together and actually do some work? As I think someone said earlier, that we've talked about this for a long time, but perhaps we haven't really globally sat down and done the work. And this is why I think this discussion is useful. I hope there'll be a discussion on this in Paris at the main IGF, because I think this is one of the preeminent questions for our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Any more reactions from the floor?
Yes, we have a reaction.
All right, thanks.
If I may, I want to talk about the key challenge that was asked. For me and for my country, the key challenge are the countries who are not following the norms and who are doing everything to ruin the existing norms and to set up something new. We call it to set up a bicycle on what is going on. I'm talking about Russia and China. So those countries are not following what all other countries are following, or the majority of our other countries are following, trying to persuade the rest of the world that what they are proposing is the best variant. So this is the key challenge, the policy of the countries who are not following the norms. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's a question of alignment and enforcement to some degree. And looking at the time, I'll turn to our participants and panelists who have been very patient, especially Christoph. Thank you very much for still being with us, although being so far away. Last words in terms of the challenges that you see, maybe from each one of the four panelists that are still with us, starting with Christoph, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks. I mean, the challenge, I think, I noticed, I said in my initial statement, I think we are going here to a world where much more things are going to be digitalized and connected. So it's not going to be as easy anymore to have everyone in the room. So, I mean, we're really going to each and every company producing products to know about cybersecurity, to need to implement, because cybersecurity is only as strong as the weakest link of the whole value chain. So I think that's going to be the key challenge going forward. How can you really bring this knowledge, which is not very well developed, to everyone? I think that the key players today, technology companies and communication companies and so on, we're not perfect, but we have an understanding and we have a very high on our agendas. But I doubt that anyone producing any connected device is doing that. And I think there are a lot of examples in the past that things have gone really bad on that side. So that's going to increase, and it's going to be even more complex to manage. But I also would like to give a little bit of hope here, not end, just with the this dystopian view of things. I think that a way forward could be to have more cooperation on national levels, to be honest. I think that the international level is important and we should work on it, but it's usually slow and it's complex. I think that on national levels, people can come together much more easily due to culture and languages, and that they are living, close to each other, and they know each other, and they have confidence. So governments, private sector, civil society on local levels should cooperate more and start working, more locally, nationally, to improve these things. The good thing about this, then, when they come to the global level, they are more educated and better informed. For example, governments who have installed national multi-stakeholder processes for cybersecurity, they will come with a better knowledge when they then discuss maybe the international norms. So that's a very important bottom-up process, and we should not forget it at all. I think it's a key here. And just to give you an example, in Chile, just a couple of weeks ago, and this is a bit outside the scope of EuroDiG, but they just founded a cybersecurity alliance nationally where we participate with our local business. And they are actually working on one very interesting issue, which is education. Education is going to be so key. I mean, we all know that we have to lock our doors when we leave the house, but we don't know, what happens with our Wi-Fi keys or the access passwords to whatever service. And people are just, waking up to that. So I think that educating people about that. And that's something where actually the states and the governments will have a huge task to bring that forward. That cannot be done by the private sector or civil society, for example. It needs to be done by the states. And that's going to be so key going forward. And as I said, the cooperation on that. So there are examples coming up. And I would say that, as someone earlier said, institutionalize these kinds of cooperation between different actors. And we all share more or less the objective of making the internet safer and more secure. So really going forward, working together on that on national and local levels could help a lot also for the global debate. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Nata, if you'd like to go next. Thanks.
Also the challenge, as our Ukrainian colleague told us, is that not all the parties and not all the big adversaries are part of the even Budapest Convention. And this is a real problem for the countries like Georgia and like Ukraine. One issue is having norms, and the second issue is enforcement of the norms. And this is the big challenge here. And as a positive continuation of these challenges, we see that maybe not conventions, but like OSCE work and competence building measures can be as soft mechanisms that step by step can ensure the better cooperation, or even like naming and shaming and using some more diplomatic channels can work here rather than legal regimes and legal conventions.
Brilliant, thanks. Martin, up to you.
Yes, there will be less left for Wolfgang to say. There's already less left for me to say. Very much support the importance of awareness and education. With ignorance, it's very difficult to create a safe internet-driven world. Whatever we do with norms, let's not assume that any norm we set will be followed by everybody. That would be a mistaken thinking. Nevertheless, setting norms will help, and set them with that understanding that not everybody may follow it, but that it still may help, the way you said it. The other remark also made is global norms are very useful, but they will be very global and not precise. It's about how you implement it locally, and to talk about the GCCS initiative that Nigel mentioned, and in a way, Wolfgang's GCSC is also one of the follow-up of that. There's also a global forum on cyber expertise that stimulates to take global norms into local action. Because in the end, you need to do it in the region as well. So, last but not least, in the end, it only works when actors become accountable, when actions become transparent, and here the complexity is in the complexity of technology, so technology will need to help to make it transparent. Second sub-bullet here is very important, is how data are collected and acted upon, and we need to have support in understanding how these things hang together. Maybe in the same way as we need support for how bookkeeping used to work a century ago or something. And last but not least, so accountability of actors, transparency of actions, and clarity on what is considered good practice.
Sorry, we'll move to one remote participation question and then come back to you, Wolfgang. David, go ahead.
You guys hear me? Okay, so we have one, I believe it's from Kiev, one remote question from Valeria Dubetska. And so the question is, as an organizer, as a co-organizer of the Youth IGF UA, it is interesting for me to find out what you all think, the panelists, of the role of youth and youngsters in the field of cybersecurity. How can the youth, the youngsters, influence today's processes? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Maybe, Wolfgang, do you want to answer it while giving your concluding statement?
Yeah. Our Nestor speaking.
To the last questions, learning, 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 and then acting, acting, acting. Be active, become engaged. Your voice is important, But before you raise your voice, you have to know what you want to say. And insofar, I can only stress what Christoph and others have said. Education is key for the future of the security in cyberspace. And it does not start at schools. It starts at home in the kindergarten. You know, I've lived 15 years in Denmark. 50% of the norms of the daily life in Denmark are unwritten rules, which are just, you know, mother and father tell children, you shouldn't do that, or this is not allowed. And there is no need to have a written norm, because these are the unwritten norms which regulate a lot of our daily life. And insofar, this is really a responsibility for everybody, for every stakeholder, but also for every families, you know, to create, let's say, an unwritten norm of normal behavior in cyberspace, a culture of behavior in cyberspace. I think this is an important challenge, but this will not be enough. So that means I said it's 50%. The other 50% are much more complicated. And just two quick comments, you know, how to move forward. Vlad and Nigel have mentioned that we see a mushrooming of different initiatives. And the risk is that all these initiatives will reinvent the wheel or will, you know, not work hand in hand, but create more competition. Travel budgets will explode because people cannot follow all these meetings. So one opportunity is really, and the IGF offers this framework, to organize big hearings in the IGF where all these organizations are invited. That means the Secretary Generals or the executive directors just, you know, are grilled, quote unquote, by the public, so they are asked questions, not give statements, long statements, but like in the US hearing that, you know, senators ask questions to people who have to testify. And I think this is probably a way forward, both for the IGF, the global IGF, but also for EuroDiG. And my very final statement, what to do with the bad guys. I understand all these concerns. Hack back is not the best option. So you need a portfolio of different reactions, which goes from hard measures to soft measures. This is absolutely clear. But one thing is, and you cannot avoid this, you know, you have to pull also the bad guys into a dialogue. If you exclude them, this is bad. So that means you have naming and shaming is important, but you have to, you know, we live on one globe, we have one internet, and we have to have this dialogue also with bad guys. And that's a better way to put them, to keep them accountability, and yet these are the norms. No. Be careful if you just go home and then behave in another way. But it's not alone the dialogue. So you have to have a portfolio, and I think what is discussed in the Tallinn Manual and others, that we are seeing that such a portfolio is developed, and if somebody, you know, can do bad things and will not, there is no risk that there will be an answer. This stimulates doing more bad things. Insofar, it's like the children that, so, okay, you have to follow these rules, otherwise you will see consequences. And I think, unfortunately, this is a bad development, but that's why I say we have to have both. We have to have a system of reactions to bad behavior, but we have to have also this dialogue where we try to build confidence and do all these soft measures which you have mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. I'll hand over to Ilona now, if you're happy to share the messages. Yeah. Yeah, sure. It's on its way.
It's working. Okay. So it was a pretty tough task to summarize what was going on this panel, because you voiced very contradictory points, but I will try. So the first is strong regulation of cyberspace could stifle innovation and development. I would like to ask you if you agree with this statement or disagree, because it's important for messages. So no objections? Okay. The understanding of norms differs from strict legal rules to self-regulation. Moreover, there is a problem of acknowledgement of the existing principles, for example, Western principles versus Eastern principles. Okay? States made a great progress in negotiating principles for cyberspace regulation, despite some failures like the recent GG of 2017. Okay, yeah, no objections. Transnational commercial giants can't dictate international conventions for cyberspace. It is the responsibility of states to come to legally binding norms. Industry has its own interest in the norm-making process to enable the development of their markets. Civil society is likely to stimulate industry to come to norms rather than produce independent initiatives. Okay? Okay. Yeah?
I think as a talking point, yes, probably not as an agreement for every participant, but yeah. Let's keep it on there for now.
We can leave it as it is.
Yeah, let's keep it on there for now.
Politics is inevitable in cyberspace due to the ongoing cyber arms racing. In contrast to cyber war, the issue of cyber stability provides more places for all stakeholders to contribute to drafting the rules that can ensure the development of information society and digital economy. Okay. And the final one. There is a disconnection between the new technologies and the response of the regulators. So self-regulation by industry may serve as a starting point for building norms on the international level. Yeah? Great.
Thank you very much for your great work. And to conclude, yeah, sorry, Martin, please go ahead.
I just missed the issue of that all players are also accountable for their actions.
Good point. Good point. And multi-stakeholder involvement. In the meantime, if I may, I would like to extend a really big thank you to all the panelists and to my co-moderator, Tatiana, and our remote moderators over there, Lauren, who organized the session, and everyone who contributed so lively. Thank you very much. I think this was a great session, and I'll hope we'll hear some more interesting thoughts later today as well. Thank you again. Show of hands for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for sticking with us for so long.
A pleasure. It was great. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.